Good evening and welcome everyone to the Narkis Street Congregation's Bible Study on Acts. And we are coming closer to the end of the book, and Paul is sailing off for Rome from Caesarea. And we're going to be reading tonight in Acts 27. And let's seriously open in prayer to begin. Lord, thank you for being with us through our storms and the things that can cause us to shipwreck, and help us to keep our focus on you. And may you speak through your word in a powerful way through your Holy Spirit tonight. We ask this in your name, Jesus. Amen. Okay, let's start reading in Acts 27. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from Andromtium, about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, Aristarchus, okay, let me get that right. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. The next day, we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. From there, we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There, the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Sinitis. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salmone. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lasea. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous, because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete, facing both southwest and northwest. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity, so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force, called the Northeaster, swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. So the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together, because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis. They lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen, just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. Tonight, we're going to start with this first part of Paul's trip to Rome, these first verses in Acts 27. And we notice immediately in the very first verse, when it was decided that we would sail for Italy, we've come back to that first person we, I, we. So the person who is writing here in Acts is coming from it from a first person perspective. And there's also mention here of Aristarchus coming with us. And so I want to remind us about these we passages in Acts. Normally, when you write a narrative, a story, you write in third person. You talk about they and them and he and her, and this is what they did and didn't do. But in Acts, there are four places where it changes from that third person to the first person. So it starts talking about we in Acts 16, in Acts 20, Acts 21, and now here on this journey to Rome in Acts 27 and 28. There is a person who appears to be a chronicler, someone who's on this journey with Paul and has joined Paul somewhere in Asia Minor back in Acts 16 and is writing with a first person account. And in church tradition, this we is often identified with Luke, the doctor, the as an eyewitness, the one who had written both the Gospel of Luke and Acts, because they're a two-part series. And what's also interesting here in Acts, when it comes to these we passages, it involves maritime travel on the sea. And so we'll notice as we look at this Bible study, this section here in Acts 27 and 28, this trip sailing to Rome, that this person seems to be very familiar with the ocean and traveling on the sea. And so scholars sometimes suggest this person may be someone who lives close to the sea. So this sea voyage, Acts 27, 28, as I mentioned, has some specific details that are tied into sailing and someone familiar with riding on a ship with wind patterns and the drift of the water and sounding depths and how you would handle a ship. And so it's very credible for Greco-Roman historiography dealing with sea narratives. As I also mentioned, in the second verse, there's this mention of this Aristarchus. He's a Macedonian from Thessalonica, which is in the area of the Greek Empire under Alexander. If you go back in Acts 20, you'll remember when Paul was in Macedonia, he was in that area, that he had a group of guys that he was traveling with, and Aristarchus was one of them. He's mentioned there with Secundus. They were both from Thessalonica. And there was also a Gaius. We all know Timothy, who was Paul's disciple, and Tychicus and Trophimus, and possibly some others. And this person who talks about we and us. So let's call that person Luke. So you'll notice here that team Timothy, Sopater, Aristarchus, Gaius, Tychicus, Trophimus, Secundus, maybe even Titus, though he's not mentioned, and then this we person who's part of the we, let's call him Luke. All of these are traveling with Paul towards Israel. So you'll remember that Macedonia is up there in the upper left corner where Troas is circled in the green, and where they become a we, they're in the red, and they are traveling Paul, taking him back to the province of Judea. And so from Troas, they head down to Miletus, and that's where Paul gives his final farewell to the elders of Ephesus. So Miletus is in the green circle, and then they continue their trip all the way down to Caesarea. And it's in Caesarea that this group arrives. And so, who was part of that group? It was Aristarchus, this the one who's mentioned here in Caesarea, who's coming with Paul, going back west, this time towards Rome. You'll remember that Caesarea, where Paul has now been in prison for the last 2 years, has become some sort of center for the believers in the land. It's first mentioned in Acts when Philip, one of the seven, goes up there and preaches the gospel. And we've talked about this before, how Caesarea is this capital at this point for the Roman province of Judea. And this is where the governors sit and rule from. And like Felix had been the governor, and then Festus, and he is the one who is sending Paul to Rome for trial. And so it's a significant city for not just being the capital, but also they have a very impressive and amazing seaport that's being used. And so this is where you would travel out west from the province of Judea. So Caesarea is where Cornelius lived, and this is where Peter came to visit him, and they became followers of Jesus, and the Holy Spirit fell there on their family. And when Paul had come back with this group, the we group, as we read here in Acts 21, they land in Caesarea. And when they land in Caesarea, they stay with Philip, and he's got daughters who prophesy. And so it seems like Philip ends up making this his home, and Agabus comes up here to visit and bring a prophecy to Paul as well. And this is where Paul is brought when he's arrested in Jerusalem and he's imprisoned in Caesarea for 2 years. So Caesarea is going to be this nexus for the followers of Jesus, and even going into church history with other church fathers as well. We know that Paul has been thinking, even though now he's under arrest, he's been taken to Rome, he's been thinking for a long time about wanting to travel to the church in Rome, to the believers there. And he wrote a letter which appears to have been written a few years earlier when he was in Corinth. And that letter to the Roman church, he mentions in there in Romans, there in the first chapter, that I pray that now at last, by God's will, the way may be open for me to come to you. So he's writing to the church there in Rome. And he even says, I planned many times to come to you, but have been prevented from doing so until now. This is how he starts his letter to the Roman believers there. And then he ends his letter in Romans in chapter 15 by reiterating that he's been longing for years to visit them. And so he's hoping to stop by Rome as he intends to go to Spain further west. But now, as he's writing this letter in Corinth, he's saying, I'm on my way to Jerusalem. And so this story that we read in Acts 21, as he's on his way to Jerusalem from Corinth and from Macedonia, would be when he had written the Romans to tell them he's on his way to Jerusalem, but he would like to come visit them. But what happens is he gets to Jerusalem, as we remember, he gets arrested on the Temple Mount. And while he's there under arrest in Jerusalem at the fortress there at the Temple Mount in the Roman barracks, it says there in Acts 23, the Lord stood near Paul and told him, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." So now Paul is getting this confirmation from the Lord that he's going to go to Rome. So he already knew this was going to happen, and this is how it's playing out in Acts. And so as they sail for Rome, which is in Italy, he is being guarded by a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We know really nothing about Julius outside of what's mentioned here in Acts. But the way he's portrayed in this one episode in Acts 27 and 28, he is portrayed as treating Paul with compassion and respect because he lets him visit with friends, and he will also listen to him as the journey goes on later on. And this cohort, which has a name connected to the first emperor, the first Roman emperor, Augustus, not a lot is known about them, and there is no real historical evidence of this specific cohort, but there might be some remains that were found in Syria that might be connected to them. But essentially, Julius is from a cohort, and um, a centurion is generally in charge of 1/10 of a Roman legion. So he's not someone who's insignificant in the Roman army. And so they board this ship and they sail west. And it's we. And one of this group of we that's going with Paul is Aristarchus. And so this is their journey west. But first, they're going to head north to Sidon from Caesarea. So Caesarea is circled in the green. They're leaving from the province of Judea, and they will travel now to Sidon in the green. And there in Sidon, Julius, the centurion, is going to let Paul visit friends that he has there. Sidon is in modern day Lebanon. It's about 75 miles north of Caesarea, and it is an ancient Phoenician or Canaanite city. And in the Bible, Sidon and Tyre are these two Phoenician cities that are mentioned often, especially in the prophets. They were very wealthy uh, cities of commerce, and the Phoenicians controlled them, and they had ports in both of those cities, and they did great business traveling throughout the Mediterranean in the ancient days. So this would be way back before Paul, that the Phoenicians kind of were very well known as mariners in that time. Sidon is famously known as the home of Jezebel. We know the wife of Ahab, king of the northern kingdom of Israel. And Jezebel is also infamously known for bringing the worship of Baal, and that should be the Asherot poles into Israel. They probably were there already, but um, they were promoted at that time and being connected to her being from Sidon or Sidon. So they were merchants, and if you read like Isaiah and Ezekiel, the prophets, they'll talk about how all these products and commodities that would be shipped through their boats around the Mediterranean, and they also were well known with the purple dye, the Tyrian purple dye that we've talked about earlier with the city of Tyre, which came from snails. And their most famous colony that they made was that the Phoenicians created on the Mediterranean was Carthage, there in North Africa. They leave Sidon and they head towards Cyprus. And notice they're following the contours of the land with the ocean, and they land at Mira. You see there circled in green. And I'm just going to go down a little rabbit trail just for fun to keep it interesting. Mira or Mura in the Greek is was an ancient city there in Asia Minor, and that journey from Sidon would have taken about 15 days by boat, and they go back into antiquity. They were Hellenized and incorporated into Alexander the Great's expansion as he conquered the world at that time in the fourth century. So that's about 400 years before Paul. And then the Romans took over. You know, what is significant for our time is there was a Christian bishop who would be born there a few hundred years after Paul, a couple hundred years after Paul. And according to tradition and legend, he was orphaned at a young age and he became a priest and later the bishop of Mira. And during the great persecution of Diocletian, the Roman emperor, when he was an adult, there were Christians that were killed throughout the Roman Empire. This is kind of the last great persecution of Christians at that time. And Nicholas was also imprisoned and suffered for his faith. But soon after Diocletian, with Constantine, there would be the legalization of Christianity. Nicholas of Myra is, according to legend, from about 700 AD. He was known for his generosity, compassion for the needy, and his acts of charity. And so there's this tradition that develops very generous saint who had a heart for children. And today, with our Santa Claus in the West, which really today has come about in the last 200 years, the Santa Claus were wearing red and so on, he was birthed from this historical figure from this city that Paul stopped in almost 2,000 years ago. And so from Myra, Paul and his ship set sail, and they actually changed ships in Myra. They changed to an Alexandrian ship that was sailing for Italy because the boat that they had taken from Caesarea to Sidon and to Myra was a smaller boat. And now they're getting onto a much larger boat that's going to go across the deeper part of the Mediterranean and on to Italy, a much longer trip. And so this Alexandrian ship in Latin was called the Corbita. It was a larger ocean-going cargo vessel. And Alexandrian in its name is important because it's coming from Egypt. And Egypt was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire at that time. And these ships go back into the time of the Greeks, and they were mainly used for transporting cargo and could carry quite a large amount of cargo. And as I was saying, Alexandria, Egypt was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, and Rome was the largest city in the world at that time. It's approximated to have around 1 million inhabitants, and the city was not able to provide enough bread for its population without importing wheat. And so wheat would be imported to Rome throughout the year. Roughly one third of the city of Rome's wheat supply was coming from Alexandria. And you may remember that famous idiom or quote with Roman emperors of bread and circuses, that what was important for a Roman emperor was to provide the people bread and circuses. And this was something that the Roman emperors had started to do earlier, where they would give their people free grain as a political appeasement, and it would help keep the people fed and not want to riot and not cause instability there in the capital of the empire. And that phrase, bread and circuses, has also come to mean something like a politician who knows how to attract people's votes or approval is not by dealing with the hard issues that will improve society, but it's only a diversion or a distraction that will keep the simplistic needs of people at bay. And so, what is that? It's food, which is what bread was, and entertainment, which is what the circuses were, the public games. And so these boats, the Alexandrian boat that Paul would have been riding on, this Corbita is an example there, is from a mosaic which is found in Tunisia, northern Africa, from the third century. This was in a house of a whole diagram of different types of seafaring vessels during the Roman period. And so the Corbita here, that's from that mosaic. This is it flipped on its right side. We know later on in Acts 27 there were 276 passengers on this boat, and it's got a massive cargo. So this is a very significant ship. And these boats would not just travel in the Mediterranean, they were also known to go in the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, even out into the Atlantic. You'll remember the Romans go up and colonize England and even up to the edges of Scotland and around the other edges, the northern edges of France. And they were made to be very large. They would have two huge side rudders, 1 to 3 masts, and they were very stable, but they were not fast because they were taking in a massive amount of stuff. And this is a cross section here. And there were different sizes of these ships, but they could be very, very large. There were no compasses at this time in the West. China had been using compasses from before Paul and Jesus, but the compass as a navigational instrument does not appear in Europe until the 14th century, for another 1300 years. And with the collapse of the Roman Empire, there will be no cargo carrying ships of this size until the 1500s. So I guess you think about the time of Portugal and Spain starting to sail out away from Europe towards the west. So these ships will be the zenith of development for the next 1,000 years. So back here on this ship, this Alexandrian ship, this large cargo ship carrying 276 people, Paul and Julius then sail from Myra towards the west, going towards Italy, and they're having difficulty. And now they're sailing down towards Crete. And so if you follow on the map there, Crete is to the left side, and they end up stopping at a place called Fair Havens. Fair Havens, which is on the southern side of Crete. And this is what it looks like today, or at least a few years ago. We know that Paul would have stopped here, and in his letter to Titus, he talks about dropping Titus off in Crete, and it's assumed by scholars that um, the historical Paul here would have perhaps gone by Crete another time, because it's obviously not this time where Titus is not even mentioned on this journey or getting off the boat. But it seems like Paul will later come back to Crete, according to Titus 1:5. But back in our story in Acts 27, the writer, the we, the person, the chronicler accompanying Paul on this trip says much time had been lost and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was now after the fast. And so Paul warns them. So what is he talking about here? Why is the sailing becoming dangerous? And before we answer that question, I want to just give a little more background to ancient seafarers in the Mediterranean. Before the Romans, there were two major nations that were seafaring in the Mediterranean. I already mentioned Phoenicia, the Phoenicians. They're in modern Lebanon. They're just above Israel. They were master shipbuilders. They focused on business, commerce, trade, and they built networks across the Mediterranean. I mentioned how Sidon was one of their cities. He founded a colony, Carthage, there in North Africa. And then the other one, the other nation that will come will be Greece, there in the red. And the Greeks, as they developed, they would build advanced warships and they would begin to dominate the Mediterranean for a few hundred years. And they colonized widely out towards Italy and North Africa and even further up into the Black Sea. And they also were into commerce. And so here's a map of these two naval powers before the time of Paul. So on the bottom in the purple, we have the Phoenicians and their influence and their colonies. They're starting from over near Israel, which is farther to the right, and going along northern Africa and there along Spain and even up to the tip to the edge of France. And the Greeks are in the red, and they had more control of the northern part of the Mediterranean Sea. But the Romans come after these two, and they kind of take what the Phoenicians and the Greeks had already done. And there were also the Egyptians. They had a navy as well, but theirs goes back even further in history. And the Romans, who were not traditionally sailors, they were more based on the land. They would subsume and acquire the technology of the Phoenicians and of the Greeks. And they would build a very powerful and large navy, and they would dominate the Mediterranean for hundreds of years. And they called the Mediterranean RC, Mare Nostrum. And so back where we read with um, Paul on his journey in Acts 27, he said the sailing had become dangerous because it was now after the fast. So during all of the ancient seafaring on the Mediterranean, whether it was the Phoenicians, the Greeks, or the Romans, they all followed a pattern. There was a season to sail on the Mediterranean, and there was a season not to. And you would sail in the summer, the dry season, when you didn't have the storms, and in the winter season, when the rains would come, the sea was closed. So from mid-September till the beginning of March was considered uh, dangerous. You could sail from mid-September to mid-November. That was risky, but you were crazy to sail after mid-November on the Mediterranean. And Acts 27:9 says that the fast had happened, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. And so now we're in October when this happens, around the year that Paul would have been sailing. And so the winter winds are out there potentially. You never know when they're going to come. They didn't have all of these meteorological computers that we have now with satellites and so forth. So you could never actually know. Paul even mentions he's got experience in sailing, and he even mentions this phenomena about in 1 Corinthians 16, where he talks about, I'll come and I'll spend the winter with you, right? I'll show up when on the last boat, and I will stay with you because I'm not going to go anywhere on the water during the winter. 2 Timothy 4, when he's writing this letter to some of his friends, he says, "Do your best to get here before winter." And that is because the sea is shutting down for the winter. It's dangerous to sail at that time. And so Paul's telling them back in our story, Acts 27, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo." We've already seen in Acts, he's already done 3 journeys going out to the west. He's got this experience of being out there. He knows what's going on. You also maybe remember in his letter in 2 Corinthians 11, where he says, "Three times I was shipwrecked, and I spent a night and a day in the open sea." 2 Corinthians would have been written before this story. So already Paul has some experience of hard times in the Mediterranean, and he's sharing his experience with these with the captain here. And obviously the captain knows what he's doing as well. But Paul is being portrayed in Acts 27 in a special light, giving insight. Um, and so, what is the deal also with the fear of the sea? And it starts in Canaanite tradition, or at least this tradition goes way back in the Mediterranean. we have There were these texts that were found in Syria in 1921, written in Ugaritic. Ugaritic was a Canaanite language, which is similar to Hebrew. Hebrew is also a type of Canaanite, Proto-Canaanite, you want to call it. And so they're both Semitic languages, Hebrew and Canaanite and Phoenician. And in these texts, there was a story that was found. It's called the Baal cycle, and in it, it talks about the gods that were worshipped or believed in up to the north in this area in Syria, and they have a god called Yam. And you might know the word Yam in Hebrew today, going all the way back into the Bible. Yam is sea, the word we have. And Mediterranean is called the Great Sea, the Big Sea. And so, who is Yam in Ugaritic? He's the god of the sea, the rivers, the storms, chaos, because the sea, the ocean, the storms, it's unpredictable, it's chaotic. And um, and Baal is the god of the in the sky that brings the rain, the fertility god. And and so here's Ugarit is up there to the north in that blue circle in Syria today. down below, and the other blue circle is Sidon. So that's where the Phoenicians were. And if you go even further down, you see Megiddo, which where we think of Armageddon, and then that's Israel, and even further down is Jerusalem. And so this is the whole neighborhood of the Bible, and this Yam, this symbol in Ugarit of a sea god. But when you come to our Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, what is Yam? Yam is the word for sea, but in the Bible, Yam or the sea, yes, it is chaotic, it is dangerous, it can even be evil. But God, Yud He Vav He, the God of Israel, does not fight with a rival deity of the sea, Yam. The Lord God, starting in Genesis 1, simply speaks, and there's chaos over the waters of the deep, and God speaks and creates, and then the waters obey. And so, according to the Bible, the Lord controls the waters and tames their chaos. And so we see this in the Psalms, like Psalm 24, how the Lord founded the seas and he's in control. Genesis 1, where the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters and the formless and the empty and the darkness over the deep. And you remember it's on the third day, I believe, where he separates the land and the waters, and he calls the waters Yamim, the seas. And God saw that it was good. And so these natural objects are not God's, they're just part of God's creation. And Psalm 93 talks about you see this image, this picture of these seas or rivers that are lifting up their voices and they're pounding waves, and it looks crazy and chaotic. But the Lord sits on high, and He is the one who is in control of them in Psalm 93. And another thing that Yam represents, the sea in the Hebrew Bible, is the Gentiles, because the nations, the Gentiles, come from the seas. And it makes sense if you think about it. You have all of these Greeks and Egyptians and Romans and whoever else is out to the west, and they're all coming on boats from the sea. Isaiah 17 talks about the nations. They rage like the raging sea. They roar like the roaring of great waters. These Gentile nations come from the seas. And even in the prophet Daniel, he talks about seeing four great beasts that come up out of the sea. And then he gives this interpretation in verse 17 that those great beasts are four kings that will rise from the earth. And so the beasts that come from the seas are four Gentile empires that will rise up. But ultimately, God is in control, and he will ultimately remove the sea. And you see this play out in Revelation 21, which, even though it's in the Greek New Testament, it's still following this Hebrew tradition of the seas. And you'll remember in the end of Revelation where John says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. So, what is removed when the sea is removed? The chaos is removed. The dangerous enemy nations are removed, the ones that threatened and harmed God's people. And when that sea is removed, the Lord wipes away the tears from the eyes, and there will be no more death, no more mourning, crying, or pain. For the old order of things, the things of the chaos and of the darkness, has passed away. So this is a little background of the sea now as Paul is out there with all of these people, and they're in a chaotic situation because they're not able to control their boat, and Paul is recommending they stay in Crete, but they don't listen to him. They're going to push on with their journey. Why is the ship owner willing to continue on when it's such a dangerous time heading into the winter? It's because of money. Because what had happened is, as Rome had grown into this empire, the city of Rome always needs wheat. And anytime there's a shortage of bread, the people can get out of control and they can even attack, and they have the quantity, the numbers, and so they can be quite dangerous for control there. And so Suetonius, a Roman historian, was writing about the Emperor Claudius during a time that there was a famine and there was lack of grain, that Claudius, the emperor, wanted grain to be brought even during winter season when it was dangerous to go out on the water. And he was even subsidizing merchant ships so that if they lost their ships during a storm, during that time that's dangerous, he would pay for their losses because he wanted the wheat to keep flowing to Rome. So it seems that this owner is also interested in the financial benefit here. And so they continue on following the the island of Crete, heading towards the west, and they're trying to get to Phoenix. Phoenix is another port area. You see it there in the green circle, and it's protected, and they're looking to make it there. And unfortunately, they start to be blown off course, and they're pushed away from Crete. And then a huge wind, a northeaster, blows them away from the island. And the word there in Greek is Euroquilo, and it seems to be a combination of Greek and Latin. A sailor's term, Strabo, a Greek historian, writes about this violent northern wind, and it blows them away from Crete by this island Calda. And then from there, it's blowing them towards North Africa, towards Libya, modern day Libya. Cyrene, you see down there, was that significant city. And so they were afraid they were going to be pushed into these sandbars of Syrtis, and then it would have been the ship would have been destroyed. And so this is talking a bit about Syrtis, and the ship is just being battered here, and they're starting now to try and keep afloat by throwing their cargo overboard. So all of that, presumably wheat, that they were probably bringing to Rome, that it was all about the money. They're now losing it and they're throwing it away. They're throwing away parts of the ship's infrastructure, the tackle. And it says there, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. And this is significant because the way the Romans led their ships was just like the Phoenicians and the Greeks had done. They had to see something to direct them. They didn't have a compass or GPS or any of that stuff. They're having to recognize landmarks, and whether it be something on the mainland or an island, and also the stars. They had to have the stars to guide them. And so when it's completely a storm and dark, you have no stars, you have nothing to guide you, and there's no land. And so they're completely lost and at the will of God, if you would. They'd given up all hope of being saved. And this word saved is significant here in Paul's journey to Rome. It's mentioned 7 times. There's 7 words related to salvation or rescue here in Paul's trip to Rome. Paul decides to give him a pep talk, and he says, "Men, you should have taken my advice." Okay, maybe it's not a pep talk, maybe it's more admonishment, but he continues on. Here's the pep talk. "I urge you to keep up your courage because none of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Because last night an angel of the God to whom I belong stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid.'" And I started thinking about Paul, and he has this connection to God showing up in powerful, palpable ways from the very beginning when Jesus appeared to him on his road to Damascus. And we also learned that when he came to Jerusalem after Damascus, he had gone to the temple, and the Lord also appeared to him in a vision as well. There in Acts 22, it was a looking back at it. And as he's traveling on his journeys to share the gospel, he'll see things. He'll see this Macedonian man, and the Spirit of Jesus will direct him. And in Corinth, he'll have another vision of the Lord telling him, "Don't be afraid." And he'll get these words from the Holy Spirit about where God is leading him, like he's going to ultimately be in prison. And then we talked about he was in the barracks, he was under arrest in Jerusalem under the Romans, and the Lord appeared to him there as well. He's now, or the angel of the Lord's appeared to him on this ship. And Paul writes other instances where he was taken up into the third heaven there in 2 Corinthians 12. So Paul has this connection to the spiritual world. Let's call it a spiritual awareness. And he's not just drifting afloat. And his final word here for tonight is, "Men, have courage because I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me." I want to end tonight with this section that 3 points. One, Paul is on this trip, this journey, which doesn't seem to be a very positive journey because he's under arrest. He's going to trial, but he is a team. He's with a team. He's got a community as he's going through this trial and this test and this upcoming shipwreck. So he's not alone. He's not I, but he's we. He's part of a we. And he has this spiritual awareness that God has a plan, even though the clouds are dark, it's stormy, it's dangerous, and it's hard to see where you're going. He knows that God has a plan and God is going to save them. And then finally, even when you can't see the stars and that storm, Paul says, "I have faith in God. I trust the Lord." And I think when he writes in 1 Corinthians 15 there, how can he have faith in God? Because Paul is not afraid of death. He says there, "Death, where is your victory? Death, where is your sting?" But thanks be to God, he gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. And so I think this is the sentiment Paul has here on this boat as he's staring into the storm, not knowing what's going to happen, but trusting the Lord that his salvation is imminent.